Germany, 2019. Part 1. A diagnosis that shatters hope. The winter sky outside was a dull gray, heavy with impending snow, as Dr. Martin Vogel sat in his office, his eyes scanning the MRI results on his computer screen. The sharp clicking of the mouse punctuated the otherwise silent room. Martin was known for his precision and unflinching pragmatism, qualities that had earned him the title of head surgeon at one of Berlin's most prestigious hospitals. His career was built on years of study, research, and relentless dedication to the science of healing. But today, even for him, the gravity of the case before him felt like an anchor dragging him down. The patient was a 10-year-old boy named Lucas Schneider, and the images on the screen painted a bleak picture. A malignant tumor nestled deep within the boy's brain was growing at an aggressive rate. It was a glioblastoma, a form of cancer that Martin knew all too well. It was the kind that didn't listen to reason or treatment, the kind that ravaged young lives with brutal efficiency. He sighed, his jaw tightening as he processed the results. As a surgeon, he had long since mastered the art of separating emotion from his work, but seeing such a grim diagnosis in a child never became easier. Outside his office, the murmur of hospital life continued. Nurses scurrying between rooms, the soft beep of monitors, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. But inside, Martin's mind was locked on the impossible task ahead. He had been through these kinds of cases many times, but each time felt like a new assault on his belief in the limits of medicine. Moments later, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He straightened his back, pushing away the emotional weight with practiced ease. "Come in," he called out, already preparing himself for the difficult conversation ahead. The door creaked open, and Helga and Andreas Schneider stepped into the room, hand in hand. They were a stark contrast. Helga, a petite woman with soft brown curls and eyes red from sleepless nights and endless worry, and Andreas, a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past few weeks. Their faces, though marked with exhaustion, still held a glimmer of hope, a hope that Martin knew he would have to temper. Lucas followed closely behind, his small figure wrapped in a hospital gown that seemed far too big for him. His face was pale, but his bright blue eyes remained full of life and curiosity, as if unaware of the storm brewing inside his own body. He climbed onto the chair next to his mother, swinging his legs idly, while Helga clutched his hand tightly, her knuckles white. Martin cleared his throat and gestured for them to sit. The room was clinical, yet sterile in its warmth. Pale blue walls, framed medical degrees, and the obligatory stack of files piled neatly on his desk. He tried to soften the hard news he was about to deliver, but there was no easy way to say it. "Mr. and Mrs. Schneider," he began, his voice steady, though his heart weighed heavy. "Lucas' tumor is very aggressive. We've run all the necessary tests, and the cancer has spread rapidly. This type of glioblastoma is known to be resistant to treatment, and the location of the tumor makes surgery extremely risky." He paused, watching as Helga's breath hitched. Andreas' grip on her hand tightened, but the couple remained silent, bracing for the worst. Martin continued, "We could begin with chemotherapy and radiation, but I need to be honest with you. The chances of a full recovery are very slim. The treatments may only slow the progression, but they won't eliminate the tumor entirely." The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Helga closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Andreas looked away, his jaw clenched in an attempt to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to overtake him. Lucas, oblivious to the specifics of the conversation, played absent-mindedly with the edge of his sleeve. It was always the same, the devastating blow of a diagnosis that stripped away hope. Martin had seen it countless times before. The long nights, the desperate decisions, the shattered families. He'd become desensitized over the years, not out of coldness, but as a necessity. A surgeon's mind had to be sharp, focused, free from the burden of sentimentality. There was no room for miracles in his world. But then Helga spoke, her voice shaking but resolute. Dr. Vogel, she said softly, opening her eyes to meet his. We understand what you're saying, and we appreciate your honesty. But we're not giving up. We believe in God, and we believe in miracles. We have faith that he will heal Lucas. Martin's brows furrowed ever so slightly. This was not the first time he had encountered such declarations of faith from patients or their families. Faith, he had found, often became a last resort when medicine failed. He respected their beliefs, but he also knew the harsh truth that prayer alone had never reversed the biological mechanisms of cancer. I understand your beliefs, Martin replied carefully, and I would never ask you to lose hope. But I do need you to be prepared for the realities of this situation. We will do everything within our power medically, but his voice trailed off, unsure how to soften the blow. Helga's eyes never wavered. We have hope in God, Dr. Vogel. No matter what the prognosis says, we believe in his power to heal. Martin nodded, though internally, he struggled to reconcile their optimism with the clinical facts. Hope, to him, was a double-edged sword, something that could uplift but also devastate when it came crashing down under the weight of reality. As they left the office, Lucas gave Martin a small, innocent wave, the kind that pierced through the layers of professionalism Martin had built over the years. He nodded in return, watching the family walk away with a sense of finality. Once they were gone, he sank back into his chair, staring at the MRI images once more. The cold truth of the scans contrasted sharply with the warmth of the family's hope. The room seemed quieter now, almost oppressively so. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the first snowflakes began to fall. Martin sat there for a long moment, pondering the vast chasm between faith and science, between hope and reality. He knew which side he stood on. His entire life had been built on reason, on tangible results, on the belief that medicine was the only thing that could save lives. He didn't believe in miracles. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a seed of doubt, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the rigidity of his thinking. He brushed it aside quickly. There was no room for such thoughts in his world. Science had its limits, yes, but faith? That was a crutch for the hopeless. At least, that's what Martin had always believed. Yet, as he sat in the dim light of his office, staring at the images of a disease that would likely claim another young life, he couldn't help but wonder, what if he was wrong? Part 2. A beacon of faith in the face of despair. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the thick Berlin skyline, casting a golden glow that spilled through the window of Lucas's hospital room. The light bathed everything in a soft, warm hue, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile white walls of the room. Machines hummed quietly, their lights blinking rhythmically, measuring Lucas's fragile life in numbers and beeps. Helga sat beside Lucas's bed, her hands clasped tightly together in silent prayer. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, remained closed in steadfast devotion. She had been like this for hours, her whispered prayers filling the quiet space between the hum of machinery. Andreas stood by the window, his large frame silhouetted against the fading daylight, staring out at the city with 1,000 thoughts swirling in his mind. Though less vocal about his faith than his wife, he had started praying too, albeit in the quiet spaces of his mind, where fear and hope wrestled for dominance. Lucas lay motionless in the hospital bed, his small body dwarfed by the maze of tubes and wires attached to him. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his face had lost the rosy color of youth. His once vibrant blue eyes now remained shut, his body subdued by the medication meant to ease his pain. Helga opened her eyes for a brief moment and looked at Lucas, her heart swelling with both maternal love and unbearable sorrow. She wiped away the tears that threatened to spill over, refusing to let despair cloud her faith. She had to believe. She had no other choice. Earlier that day, friends from their church had visited, offering not only their prayers but their presence, a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. They had surrounded Lucas's bed, holding hands in a circle, each voice lifting up a prayer to heaven. "Lord, we know that nothing is impossible for you," one of them had said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We ask for your healing touch on Lucas. We asked for a miracle. They prayed for hours, their voices rising and falling in unison, the room filled with words of faith. Helga had never stopped praying since the moment they left. The stream of visitors had dwindled as the day turned to night, but her prayers had not. She remained resolute, refusing to let doubt creep into her heart. She believed in a God who performed miracles, and she was determined that Lucas's life would be one of them. Andreas finally turned away from the window, walking over to Helga. He knelt beside her, his large hand covering hers as he joined her in prayer. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "God, please hear us. We can't lose him. Please." For the first time in days, Andreas let a tear slip down his face. He had been trying to be strong, to hold it all together for Helga, for Lucas, but the weight of the situation was too much. His faith had been tested before, but nothing like this. Nothing as profoundly painful as watching his only son slip away day by day, while feeling utterly powerless to stop it. The doctors had been clear. There was nothing more they could do. The treatment was only prolonging the inevitable. But Helga had refused to accept that finality, and Andreas followed her lead, trying his best to hold on to the belief that somehow God would intervene. Martin had stopped by earlier in the day, his expression guarded as always, yet somehow softer than usual. He had seen the gatherings, the prayers, the fervent hope that surrounded Lucas's room like an invisible shield. To him it was all foreign. He had never witnessed such intense displays of faith, and while he admired the dedication, he couldn't allow himself to be swayed. Science was precise. Faith was, in his view, unreliable, an emotional response to fear and loss. But something about Lucas's case began to unsettle Martin in a way he hadn't anticipated. Each time he entered that room, the energy was different. The air felt thick with something he couldn't quite name. Hope? Or was it desperation? He wasn't sure anymore. Still, he remained clinical in his assessments, delivering updates with the same detached professionalism. Yet, each time he walked away, he found himself thinking about Lucas longer than usual. He found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. Back in the hospital room, Helga's voice grew louder as she prayed, her words filled with a desperate longing. "God, we know you can heal him. Please, don't let this be the end. We trust you. We give everything into your hands." Her words echoed in the room, but more than that, they echoed in the hearts of those who heard them. Even the nurses who came to check on Lucas occasionally paused, a flicker of emotion crossing their faces as they watched this mother pour out her heart to a God they weren't sure was listening. Faith, to them, was something they had learned to push aside in the face of medical facts. But Helga's faith was unshakable, and for a moment, they wondered if there might be something to it. Hours passed, and the hospital room fell into a stillness that only comes late at night. Lucas slept peacefully, his breathing steady, unaware of the battle being fought for his life. Andreas had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, his hands still resting on Helga's while she continued to pray softly, her words a constant murmur in the quiet night. The room felt both sacred and sorrowful, a place where hope and despair existed side by side. Helga's faith, though strong, was not without its moments of fear. There were times when the darkness crept in, when the silence of the hospital felt like an endless void, where her prayers seemed to disappear into nothingness. But each time, she pushed those thoughts aside, clinging to the belief that God was listening. She believed he would answer. As the night wore on, the moonlight filtered through the window, casting soft shadows across the room. The quiet was almost suffocating, but in the stillness, there was also a sense of waiting, of anticipation. For Helga, this was not just a passive vigil. It was a spiritual battle, and she wasn't fighting it alone. Her faith told her that God was in this room, that he was watching over Lucas even now. Martin had left the hospital hours ago, but even at home, he couldn't stop thinking about Lucas. He had seen countless terminal cases in his career, and none had ever affected him like this one. There was something different about Lucas, something about the quiet faith of his parents that lingered in Martin's mind. He found himself wondering for the first time in a long while if maybe, just maybe, there were things beyond his understanding. Helga's prayers continued long into the night. Her voice, though tired, never wavered. In that small hospital room, she fought for her son's life the only way she knew how, with faith, with words, and with the fierce, unyielding love of a mother. And so, the night passed, the quiet hum of machines keeping time with Lucas's steady breathing. For Helga and Andreas, the hours were filled with prayers and whispered hopes, while outside, the snow began to fall silently, blanketing the city in a cold, quiet stillness. But inside, in the warmth of that hospital room, a different kind of hope was taking root, a hope that no diagnosis could extinguish and no doctor could fully comprehend. Part 3. The Unseen Shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the background as Dr. Martin Vogel sat at his desk, the familiar sterile smell of disinfectant clinging to the air. His fingers drummed lightly against the polished wood surface, his eyes narrowing as they fixated on the screen before him. He had been reviewing the latest scan results of Lucas Schneider for the past hour, hoping, though not expecting, to find some explanation for what he was seeing. It was a cold morning, the kind that settled into your bones and made the world outside feel distant and unwelcoming. But here, in the confines of the hospital, the warmth of Lucas's room and the hum of medical equipment felt strangely comforting, at least to everyone but Martin. He had been through these motions 1,000 times before, reviewing scans, checking treatment progress, and preparing for the difficult conversations that often followed. But this was something else entirely. Lucas's scans didn't make sense. 3 months had passed since that fateful conversation with Helga and Andreas, where he had laid out the grim reality of their son's diagnosis. He had been honest as always. There was no point in sugarcoating it when the prognosis was that dire. The tumor had been relentless, spreading quickly and mercilessly through the young boy's brain. Every treatment they had applied was designed to slow the inevitable, not reverse it. Chemotherapy, radiation, these were tools to buy time, not miracles. And yet, Martin's eyes traced the lines of the latest MRI scans for what felt like the 100th time. The tumor was shrinking, not just stabilizing, but regressing, something that, in his professional opinion, should have been impossible. His fingers hovered over the computer's keyboard, his mind wrestling with the implications. He had already cross-referenced the images, run additional tests, and consulted with other specialists. The results were consistent. Lucas was improving. But how? He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He had seen many patients come and go, had witnessed the miraculous resilience of the human body on rare occasions, but nothing like this. Nothing that defied medical explanation so profoundly. The boy's treatments should have only slowed the cancer down, not reversed it. And yet, here it was, indisputable evidence that the tumor was retreating, bit by bit, as though something unseen was pushing it back. Martin shook his head, refusing to entertain the whispers of doubt creeping into his mind. There had to be an explanation. He had to find it. The door creaked open, and Nurse Anya stepped in, her soft voice breaking the silence. "Dr. Vogel, Lucas's parents are here for your update." Martin nodded, closing the file on his desk with a quiet thud. He stood up, adjusting the stethoscope around his neck, his mind still grappling with the incomprehensible. He had dealt with difficult cases before, but none that had shaken his understanding of medicine as this one had. He wasn't ready for what he was about to tell Helga and Andreas, because he wasn't sure he even believed it himself. As he entered the examination room, Helga and Andreas stood by Lucas's bed. Helga was kneeling beside her son, holding his hand, whispering words of prayer as she had done every single day since they had first arrived. Andreas stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on his son's face, a mix of hope and exhaustion written into the deep lines of his face. Lucas lay there, his body still frail, but there was a new energy in the room, one that Martin couldn't deny. The boy's pale complexion had warmed, his breathing was steady, and his eyes, once dulled by the weight of pain and medication, now glimmered with life. He was against all expectations getting better. Martin took a deep breath and approached the family, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "Mr. and Mrs. Schneider," he began, his voice unusually tentative, "I've reviewed Lucas's latest scans. The tumor is shrinking. Helga's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. What did you say? Martin nodded slowly, his eyes darting between Helga and Andreas. The tumor is regressing. I've cross-checked the results, and there's no mistake. Lucas is improving, but he hesitated, his natural caution kicking in. But this is highly unusual. I've never seen a case like this before, especially with a cancer as aggressive as his. Andreas, who had remained silent until now, spoke, his voice filled with cautious optimism. So, he's going to get better? Martin shifted his weight, the logical part of his brain struggling to keep control. It's too early to make any guarantees, but based on what we're seeing, it's possible. There's still a long way to go, but his body is responding in a way that none of us expected. Helga's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she held Lucas's. It's God, she whispered, her voice full of conviction. He's healing our boy. Martin felt the familiar tension rise in his chest at the mention of divine intervention. He respected Helga's faith, but the idea of attributing this miraculous improvement to something beyond the realm of science didn't sit well with him. There had to be a reason, a cause he hadn't uncovered yet. Miracles, in his mind, were simply unexplained phenomena, nothing more. I can't explain it, Martin said carefully, but I would caution against attributing this to something we can't prove. We still have a lot of tests to run, and this kind of progress, while remarkable, is not entirely unheard of. There could be other factors at play. Helga, however, wasn't listening to the doctor's caveats. Her heart was full of hope, her faith unwavering. She looked down at Lucas, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, her tears falling onto the bed sheets. "Thank you, God," she murmured. "Thank you for answering our prayers." Andreas placed a hand on Martin's shoulder, his eyes reflecting a gratitude that transcended words. "Doctor, we know you've done everything you can, but we believe God has had his hand in this. We've prayed for a miracle, and we believe that's what we're seeing." Martin forced a tight smile, though inside his mind raced with questions. He wasn't ready to concede that what was happening could be explained by anything other than medical science. And yet, with every scan, every test, the answer remained elusive. As the family basked in the unexpected news, Martin excused himself, retreating to his office. He sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the scans once more. How could something so impossible be happening right in front of him? He had dedicated his life to understanding the human body, to unraveling its mysteries and solving the puzzles it presented. But this was beyond any equation he could solve. He leaned back, the weight of his disbelief pressing down on him. Faith, prayer, God's intervention. These were not things he had ever considered in the course of his work. But now, the lines between science and faith were blurring in ways he had never anticipated. He found himself caught between two worlds, the one he understood and the one he couldn't explain. Martin closed his eyes, exhaustion seeping into his bones. There was no logical explanation for what he was seeing, but there it was, the tumor shrinking, Lucas recovering. The facts were undeniable, and yet, the cause remained just beyond his grasp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Martin realized he was facing something far more complex than a medical anomaly. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking into the unknown, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure which way to turn. Part 4. A Crisis of Belief. The rain pounded relentlessly against the window of Martin's office, each drop a sharp reminder of the inner storm brewing within him. The familiar sounds of the hospital, a mix of footsteps, conversations, and the occasional beeping of machines, felt distant, as if muffled by the weight of the thoughts swirling in his mind. The normally tidy and orderly office was now cluttered with stacks of medical journals, open books, and printed articles strewn across his desk. Martin had spent the last week diving into research, desperately trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening with Lucas. He had pored over case studies, medical anomalies, and anything remotely related to spontaneous cancer remission. But nothing he read could account for what he had witnessed. Science had an answer for nearly everything. That's what he had always believed. But this was different. Lucas's recovery, though gradual, was continuing at a pace that defied all medical predictions. The tumor had continued to shrink, and every new scan showed signs of improvement. Martin sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the piles of papers in front of him. His mind was exhausted, stretched thin by the conflicting emotions he'd been grappling with. For years, he had been the pillar of reason, the one who offered patients and families comfort through knowledge, facts, and the certainty that medicine could provide. But Lucas's case had shaken him to his core, making him question the very foundation of his beliefs. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and Nurse Anya entered, holding a clipboard. Her expression was one of quiet concern. "Dr. Vogel, Lucas's latest test results just came in. They show further regression of the tumor." Martin rubbed his temples, trying to process the information. "Thank you, Anya. You can leave them on my desk." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Doctor, I don't mean to overstep, but have you ever considered that maybe this isn't something science can explain?" Martin looked up, surprised by her candidness. Anya had worked with him for years, and she had always been professional, following his lead without question. But this time, there was something different in her eyes, something beyond the usual clinical detachment he expected from his staff. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "What are you suggesting, Anya?" She shifted uncomfortably, as if weighing her words carefully. "I've seen things in this hospital, things that don't always make sense. And Lucas, well, it's hard to ignore the role that faith seems to be playing here. His family's prayers, their unwavering belief. It's almost as if something bigger is at work." Martin stared at her, his rational mind recoiling at the suggestion. But deep down, something stirred, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. "You're telling me to believe in miracles?" "I'm saying that maybe this is one of those times where science and faith intersect. Maybe it's not about one or the other." She smiled gently before leaving the room, her words lingering long after she had gone. Martin sat there, her suggestion gnawing at him. Faith, miracles, words he had dismissed for most of his life as emotional crutches for those who couldn't face reality. But now, reality was slipping through his fingers. Lucas was getting better, and there was no scientific explanation for it. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of his office. His mind raced back to conversations he had had with other doctors, colleagues who had recounted stories of patients who defied medical odds. He had always attributed those to misdiagnoses or statistical outliers, anomalies that could be explained away with enough data. But now, standing on the precipice of this unexplainable recovery, he wasn't so sure. He couldn't stop thinking about Helga and Andreas. Their unwavering faith had been a constant presence, a force that had filled Lucas's room with hope and determination. Martin had always admired their resilience, but he had never truly understood it. To him, hope was an abstract concept, something patients clung to when there was nothing left. But now, watching Lucas's recovery unfold, hope seemed like something more, something powerful. He couldn't ignore the facts any longer. The tumor, which had once seemed to have an unyielding grip on Lucas's life, was retreating. Each new scan showed undeniable progress. Lucas's energy had returned, and his appetite was back. The nurses spoke in hushed tones of the miracle boy, a nickname that unsettled Martin more than he cared to admit. Martin ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He had always prided himself on being a man of science, someone who never let emotions cloud his judgment. But here he was, standing in the midst of an inexplicable situation, with faith staring him in the face. The idea of faith had never fit into Martin's worldview. He had been raised in a secular household, where reason and logic were the cornerstones of understanding the world. His parents had been pragmatic people, teaching him that hard work and intelligence were the only paths to success. They had never gone to church, never talked about God or religion. Martin had carried those values with him into his career, and they had served him well. Until now. He sat back down at his desk, picking up the clipboard Anya had left. Lucas's latest test results were there, clear as day. The tumor had shrunk by another 5%. Martin stared at the numbers, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't possible. And yet, it was happening. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Helga, requesting a meeting to discuss Lucas's latest scans. Martin hesitated before answering. He wasn't sure what to say to her anymore. The facts he had relied on were slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in his career, he didn't have an answer. He agreed to meet with the Schneiders later that afternoon, but as he hung up the phone, he realized something had shifted inside him. He had always been so certain, so sure of the boundaries between science and belief. But now, those boundaries were blurring, and he didn't know where to draw the line anymore. When Helga and Andreas arrived, they were beaming. Lucas, though still in his hospital bed, had regained enough strength to sit up, his cheeks flushed with color. Helga's eyes were filled with tears of joy, and Andreas's face reflected the overwhelming relief of a father who had been given his son back. "Dr. Vogel," Helga said, her voice trembling with gratitude, "we can't thank you enough. We know this is God's work. We've been praying every day, and we believe he's healing Lucas." Martin felt his stomach tighten. He wanted to share in their joy, to bask in the relief that should come with seeing a patient improve. But instead, he was filled with unease. He couldn't bring himself to tell them that he didn't have an answer, that he didn't understand why Lucas was getting better. And he certainly couldn't tell them that, for the first time in his life, he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. "Lucas's progress is remarkable," he said carefully, "but we're still monitoring him closely. There's a lot we don't know about this kind of remission." Helga smiled, her faith unshaken. "We know, Dr. Vogel, but we also know that this is a miracle. God is healing him." Martin nodded, but inside, the turmoil continued to churn. He couldn't deny the evidence in front of him. Lucas was recovering, and it wasn't because of anything he had done. It wasn't because of medicine or science. It was happening, and he couldn't explain it. As the Schneiders left the room, Martin was left alone with his thoughts once again. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a stillness that filled the hospital corridors. Martin sat in his chair, staring out the window. The city of Berlin stretched out before him, glistening in the post-rain haze. For the first time in his life, Martin Vogel, a man of science, found himself standing on the edge of belief. The answers he had spent his entire career searching for suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of something much larger than himself. Part 5. A leap into the unknown. The old stone church stood tall against the bright blue sky, its bell tower casting a long shadow over the cobblestone streets below. Inside, the air was filled with the soft hum of whispered prayers, the rustling of books, and the occasional creak of wooden pews. The smell of incense lingered, mingling with the warm, earthy scent of the building's ancient walls. It was a place that had stood through wars, revolutions, and generations, yet it had always remained a sanctuary of faith and hope for those who sought solace within its doors. Martin Vogel stepped hesitantly into the dimly lit church, his polished shoes echoing softly against the stone floor. He had been invited here by Helga and Andreas Schneider, the parents of the boy whose recovery had shaken Martin to his core. Lucas, now a picture of health, sat at the front of the church, his hands clasped in quiet reverence as the service began. Martin had agreed to attend this special ceremony, though he wasn't sure why. Something inside him had pulled him here, something he couldn't yet explain. The church was filled with people, family, friends, and members of the community who had come together to celebrate what they saw as nothing short of a miracle. Lucas's recovery had spread through the town like wildfire, his story whispered in coffee shops, discussed in medical circles, and shared in prayer groups. To those who believed, it was proof of God's power, a testament to the unwavering faith of the Schneider family. But for Martin, it was a conflict he had yet to resolve. He found a seat at the back, his hands resting on his lap as he observed the proceedings. The pastor stood at the altar, his voice calm and steady as he recounted the miracle of Lucas's recovery, attributing it entirely to the power of prayer and God's grace. Martin listened, his rational mind fighting to reject the simplicity of such an explanation. And yet, as he glanced at Lucas, alive, well, and vibrant, He couldn't help but feel the pull of something deeper, something beyond science. The pastor's words flowed over him, the familiar rhetoric of faith and healing, of God's intervention in the lives of those who believed. Martin had heard it all before, but never had it felt so personal, so directed at him. The evidence of Lucas's recovery was irrefutable. The boy had defied every medical prognosis, every scientific understanding of what was possible. And yet, here he was smiling, healthy, surrounded by people who had never lost faith in his healing. Martin's mind wandered back to those days in the hospital, to the sterile, clinical environment where he had clung so fiercely to his belief in medicine, in logic, in science. He had been trained to view the human body as a machine, complex but ultimately understandable. But Lucas's case had shattered that understanding. It had left Martin standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of what lay beyond the boundaries of his knowledge. The service continued, the pastor speaking of faith as a bridge between the known and the unknown, a way to navigate the mysteries of life that science couldn't answer. Miracles, the pastor said, his voice rising with conviction, are not about defying the laws of nature. They are about reminding us that there is more to life than we can see, more than we can measure or explain. Martin felt a lump form in his throat. His entire career had been dedicated to explaining the unexplainable, to solving the mysteries of the human body through careful study and observation. But Lucas's recovery had slipped through his fingers, evading every attempt he made to categorize it as an anomaly or a statistical outlier. It wasn't just a remission. It was something more. As the pastor finished his sermon, the congregation began to sing. The sound of voices rising in unison filled the church, the melody simple yet profound. Martin watched as Helga and Andreas stood beside their son, their hands raised in gratitude, their eyes closed in prayer. They had never wavered, never doubted for a moment that God would heal Lucas. And now, standing in this church, Martin felt the weight of their belief pressing down on him. He had always considered faith to be an abstraction, something people turned to when they had no other options. But now, he was beginning to see it differently. Faith wasn't just about answers. It was about trust in something larger, something beyond the reach of human understanding. The song faded, and the pastor invited Lucas to the front of the church. The boy stood up, walking with the energy and grace of someone who had never been sick a day in his life. The congregation watched in silence, their eyes filled with awe as Lucas approached the altar. "Lucas," the pastor began, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, "you are a living testament to the power of faith. Your healing has touched us all, reminded us that God's power is greater than any obstacle we face." Lucas smiled, glancing over at his parents. "I don't remember much of being sick," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But I remember my mom and dad praying every day. I remember them telling me that God was with me, even when I couldn't see him. And now, I know that's true." The congregation erupted in applause, and as Martin watched, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent months trying to reconcile what had happened, trying to fit Lucas's recovery into a framework that made sense to him. But now, sitting in this ancient church, surrounded by people whose faith had never wavered, he realized something important. Not everything needed to be explained. Sometimes, things happened that were beyond human understanding, beyond the scope of science or logic. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The applause died down, and the congregation bowed their heads in prayer. Martin found himself doing the same, though he wasn't sure why. He didn't know what he believed in anymore. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. It didn't feel like a failure or a weakness. It felt like an opening, a step into the unknown. As the service ended, people began to file out of the church, their conversations light and filled with joy. Martin lingered, watching as Helga and Andreas spoke with friends and family, their faces lit with the quiet peace of those who had walked through the fire and come out the other side unscathed. Martin approached them slowly, his hands in his pockets, unsure of what to say. When Helga saw him, she smiled warmly and reached out to take his hand. "Dr. Vogel," she said, her voice full of gratitude, "thank you for everything." We couldn't have done this without you. Martin shook his head, his throat tight with emotion. I didn't do anything, he said quietly. It was your faith, your prayers. That's what healed him. Helga squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with understanding. Maybe, she said softly, it was both. As Martin left the church, the late afternoon sun bathed the city in a golden light. The air was crisp, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He still didn't have all the answers. He still didn't fully understand what had happened with Lucas. But he was learning to live with that uncertainty, to embrace the possibility that there were forces at work in the world that he couldn't measure or control. Martin walked down the cobblestone streets, his mind turning over the events of the past few months. He had always been a man of science, but now he was beginning to see that there was room for something more, something that couldn't be found in a lab or a textbook. Perhaps faith and science weren't at odds after all. Perhaps they were two sides of the same coin, each offering a different way to navigate the mysteries of life. And for the first time, Martin was ready to accept that. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.